Imagine waking each afternoon to carry a cup in your hands, porcelain against your palm, steam curling into the same air where your child's cries still echo. Imagine serving tea to the woman who tore your daughter's back raw in front of the entire house. That is where this story begins. A slow, patient vengeance folded into the rhythms of a kitchen in a place called Fazenda das Flores, 1863, the height of the coffee boom in Minas Gerais, where wealth was counted in sacks of coffee and power lived under the eaves of the Casa Grande, the big house. Content warning. This story contains descriptions of corporal punishment, sustained violence, and trauma. It is based on regional oral histories and accounts reported in local memory. Some details remain indefinido, and viewers are encouraged to refer to the video description and pinned comment for trigger warnings and source notes. They called her Benedita. She was an enslaved woman, a cook in the Casa Grande, the kind of person whose labor kept both the dining table and the family's reputation in order. Her daughter was Maria, young, fierce in a way that frightened the household, often spoken about in low, resentful tones by those who preferred order. The woman who administered that order, at least in the mornings and on afternoons when the house held visitors, was Dona Isabel Ferreira de Andrade, sister to the Coronel Antonio Ferreira, who owned Fazenda das Flores. Dona Isabel oversaw the household with a thin smile and a precise cruelty. The house had its own language: Sinha, the lady; Chenzala, the slave quarters; Capataz, the overseer. Each word mapped a place and a function, and each function carried a violence that made flight impossible. This is not a legend told for theater. It is a narrative stitched from the testimonies whispered in village yards, and in the slow, certain cadence of the older women who survived. Where archives fall silent, memory picks up the pen. What follows respects that tension between record and recollection. Reported, remembered, disputed in small ways, but consistent in its moral thrust. If this story is landing for you, if the weight of that first image is already a knot in your chest, subscribe. The channel collects forgotten histories like this. We will return often to places that time tried to smooth over. The punishment happened on a Sunday, the sort of day when the house was full of family and friends and men in pressed coats who loved to be seen as generous. The plantation paraded itself then. Tables groaned, servants hustled, music might float from a parlor. The whip, when it fell, was meant to be both punishment and instruction, an object lesson that bodies under the Casa Grande answered to a social order. On that afternoon, Maria stood in the courtyard between the sugar cistern and the ornamental trees, her blouse torn, her arms bound. 50 lashes. Not an even number for spectacle. Raw, ragged, a count meant to be remembered. You do not need a long catalogue of the injuries to grasp the effect. The slap of leather against skin, the sound that made everyone hush. Dona Isabel's voice calm as she read the list of supposed transgressions. Guests who shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable but not intervening. Benedita watched from the kitchen doorway, where steam and the sharp scent of citrus and frying oil blurred the line between duty and witnessing. She held nothing in her hands, because there was nothing she could hold that would change what the eyes of the household had chosen to see. A warning to others, a spectacle of control. Grief is a thing that moves in many directions. At first, Benedita's grief was a paradox of silence. It pressed against her chest but did not rise in complaint. In the Chenzala, the other women gathered after, tending to Maria the way one tends to burned cloth, with warm cloths, with whispered songs, with stories about gods and ancestors. There was a swaddling of an older logic, to hide, to survive, to keep the children. But grief alone did not become promise, until Benedita saw what the law could not undo. The community could not contest, and the capataz would not be trusted to judge his own master's sister. There is a kind of fury that cools into calculation. Benedita's fury did not make a sound. It moved like smoke into the cracks of the house's daily life. The Casa Grande was not a single room. It was a choreography. Silver polished in the morning, china arranged just so, the clock that marked the rhythms of meals and visitors. Benedita had been given a particular place in that choreography. Cook, keeper of the tea, the woman who knew the calendar of the household as intimately as the family itself knew their histories. In the afternoons at 4 o'clock, there was almost always the same ritual. A tray of tea taken to the drawing room, cups placed just to the right of the chair where Donna Isabel liked to sit. The conversation arranging itself around the small porcelain circle where tea steam would lift like a pale flag. To most in the house, a ritual is invisible because it is habitual. To someone whose life is catalogued and policed by habit, ritual can be a door. Benedita's attention sharpened. If law was blind and neighbors complicit, she turned to what she could observe. She watched the way the servants moved, which side of the room the maid approached from, how the capataz took his coffee, how a doctor was called, and how his notes were offered in polite, muffled sentences. She watched the way Donna Isabel preferred her tea. The cup washed in hot water first, the lids removed with the same hand each day. The way the woman lifted the cup to her lips with a little tilt of the chin, as if looking past the people into some empty space of control. Patience became a tool as much as grief. Over the following months, Benedita reduced her life to inches of time. The seconds she could stand near the tea tray and not be noticed, the pauses between conversation when a hand would not move, the days when guests changed and the ritual shifted ever so slightly. 3 months of attention is not theatrical. It is a measurement. It is the time needed to learn a house in the way only someone who cleans in the night and cooks in the day can learn it. The small shortcuts and longer patterns, the ways secrets could hide in plain sight. There are 2 kinds of knowledge moving in the kitchen. One is the knowledge of household logistics, who eats at what hour, which silver must be polished for which guest, which words to use so a Sinha's mood does not shift into rage. The other is the older knowledge, ancestral and oral. The knowledge carried from the mata, the forest, of which plants bitter and which soothe, of poultices and teas, of which leaves tend to cool fevers, and which are believed to bring on a sleep that looks like death. This second knowledge is not a manual. It is a language of warning and remedy, handed down in clipped sentences and careful gestures. Benedita had listened to it all her life, between tasks, in the dark when children slept and women exchanged small confidences. She had learned names in the tongue of the forest without ever writing them down, because to name something out loud was sometimes to call it into being. She did not talk about vengeance in the Chenzala. To speak openly about retribution was itself a risk. To be found conspiring could bring an immediate brutality that the house was quick to administer. But she began to move differently, lingering near the larder, passing a hand across a shelf, practicing the angle of a tray until it felt like a part of her body. Memory and patience made a strategy. There is a moral geometry here that must be mapped with care. To many who listen, revenge is a simple word with a black edge. For those who lived within a system that denied them any avenue of lawful redress, justice itself folded into clandestine acts. Benedita's choice was not theatrical vengeance. It was the transformation of a limited agency into a long game. This story refuses easy judgments because it lives in that morally ambiguous space where the law is absent and survival pushes the limit of what one might call justice. On an afternoon when the house seemed like a theater rehearsing the same play, Benedita began to test the boundaries of attention. She noticed the doctor, a regional physician who made house calls and whose notes residents remembered as polite and patient. He would pronounce what the family desired: stress, overwork, an old wound flaring into an infection. His voice was the kind that provided explanations that did not need to be scrutinized too closely. Donations of small medicines were handed to the housekeeper, and the household accepted the doctor's certainty because it allowed the family to keep the conversation of class and propriety uninterrupted. Benedita learned the doctor's cadence as one learns the cadence of a liturgy. He did not ask questions that unraveled a plantation's secret. He labeled and moved on. That labeling, chronic complaint, slow decline, would become, in time, a cover. But there was time between name and narrative. In the household, that time was the place where Benedita acted. You might ask, what could a single person do against the architecture of a plantation? The answer is that power under the Casa Grande was built on predictability. Take predictability away, and cracks appear. Benedita's plan was, above all, a practice in exploiting those cracks. She did not speak of it aloud. She did not plot with others because distrust was a constant in the Cenzala. A whisper could become a chain that led to punishment. 3 months of observation sharpened into a quieter phase, the gathering. This is where the story grows dense with feeling and sparse on detail. Benedita moved into the margins of the house's day and into the green margins beyond the fields. She talked to women in markets, to old cousins who remembered the healing gestures of their grandmothers. She listened to names sung softly in dark kitchens, names of leaves, of barks, of seeds, and she stored them like a ritualist saves prayers. She understood that what she needed could not be described in a recipe. It was not directions anyone might follow. It was a presence, a powder, a handful of histories pressed into something almost invisible. The people who later spoke of these events described the gathering as ordinary. Seeds collected on walks, leaves dried in the heat, small objects kept in the hollow of an old mortar. Those recollections are part of the oral web. They resist the tidy specificity that court records demand. The days wore a rhythm. There was the morning bustle when the house woke, and the day wore its apron. There were the afternoons when guests sometimes lingered until the light leaned west. Benedita learned to move like the light, to appear only where she was supposed to be seen, but not read. She perfected the hands of service, palms steady, step measured, a voice that carried no tremor. The tray became a metronome. Each time she set porcelain down, she rehearsed the tilt of her wrist that would not betray the smallness of her plan. She was not the only one hiding suffering. In the Cenzala, other bodies kept loose stories of harm and repair. Women told of children taken to the sugar fields, of husbands sold, of scornful barbs from women like Donna Isabel, who saw smiles as weaknesses. But there was also the unvoiced understanding that certain tasks must remain solitary. Benedita kept the detail of her steps private. There was a reason. The fewer who knew, the less chance of the story's collapsing under its own weight. Even as her plan congealed into something that could be carried, the moral cost remained a constant. Benedicta thought of Maria's scarred back in the mirror of a window's reflection, a silhouette of ribs and raised lines that no balm fully softened. She thought of nights when she woke at the sound of a horse in the distance, imagining the house delivering another order, another chastisement. Revenge in her mind was a way to rewrite a small ledger of harm, to have the scales tilt, finally, in any direction at all. This is where one must pause before deciding. There is an intimacy to the act that will forever alter oneself. Benedita knew this and counted the cost. One afternoon, near the end of the 3-month observation, Benedita watched a scene that would fix the precise target of her action. Guests had arrived, a family from a neighboring fazenda, and the drawing room was full of small talk and the scratch of a quill. Donna Isabel, in a dress heavy with lace and disdain, sat by the window with a porcelain cup between her fingers. A sunbeam landed on the cup and lit the steam like incense. For a moment she closed her eyes and inhaled. Benedita saw the exact angle of the cup, saw how the woman's thumb rested on the rim, saw the delicate way the ring on her finger caught the light. In that instant, Benedita catalogued the entire ritual, the chair, the cup, the tilt. She learned how fast she would need to move when the time came, when the space offered itself as it did now. She began to place smaller trials into the current of the ritual. Nothing that would warrant suspicion. A faint rearrangement of sugar here, a different stirring spoon there. A new motion practiced, so that whatever small thing she carried would look like a perfect piece of service. The house rewarded conformity by forgetting the person who conformed. In that forgetting lived Benedita's plan. We should be careful with what comes next. This is not a how-to. The narrative will not describe recipes or dosages or methods. It will instead describe the human economy around such acts. Concealment, normalization, the doctor's soothing phrases, the family's eagerness to explain with familiar causes. For weeks after Benedita's tiny changes, Donna Isabel complained, to no one who mattered, about headaches, about a fatigue that tasted like winter. She called the doctor, who made the rounds and offered labels that kept the household's reputations intact. A neighbor might ask, in passing gentility, if the heat had been catching. The word infection might be offered later on a piece of paper in a hand that did not want to linger on anything messy, and yet there were moments of almost discovery. Once, a young maid lingered at the tray with a question about a spoon. Once, a guest shifted a cup and almost saw the minute difference in how a sugar bowl had been refilled. Each brush with exposure pressed into Benedita's face the precariousness of the enterprise. She learned to be a mirror of the house's composure. In the Cenzala, one learns to let the world think what it wishes. True freedom is not in convincing the world, but in moving within the world without breaking its small, brittle rules. Time stretched. The repetition of the tea ritual, the tray, the steam, the tilt, became a slow clock, counting a different kind of years. Benedita kept watch like someone guarding not a thing but an outcome. She measured the hours between service and the doctor's next visit. She watched how Donna Isabel's skin, once smooth and preened, began to carry what the house would call a pallor. It is important to note, the narrative does not record sudden, dramatic collapse. The decline, according to the accounts, was slow. It read like the unthreading of a seam. Sometimes people attributed it to the weather, to an old wound reopened, to the burden of running a house in a changing economy. The physician supplied terms that made the decline comprehensible and thus bearable to those with power, a comforting narrative that allowed them to avoid further questions. What became clear to Benedita, more than anything, was the household's appetite for explanations that preserved social order. Chronic complaint, weak constitution, liver trouble, phrases that wrapped illness in a language of respectability. Those phrases were, in effect, an accomplice. They would erase for a time the suspicion of deliberate malice, because they fit the pattern genteel society wanted to see, that the bodies of the elite could be fragile, and that nothing about their fragility implicated the house's moral economy. And so Benedita continued. The kitchen work layered over the plan like a cloak. She chopped, she stirred, she called the timers in a voice without tremor. She laughed at the small jokes that floated into the kitchen from the servants' corridor. She held Maria at night, fingers combing through hair that still smelled faintly of dust and vinegar. Maria, for her part, moved with a wariness that made her beautiful, in a way that frightened Benedita anew. The small pauses in her laugh, the way she kept her shoulders rounded as if to protect a damaged place. There was a quiet scene one evening that became a hinge in Benedita's life. The house was asleep except for the gonging of a distant clock. She sat with Maria by a small lamp, hands busy mending a sleeve. Maria asked no questions about plans and seemed to sense that some things were not for children to hold. Yet she spoke, in a voice folded around everyday matters, of a future she did not imagine for herself. A small house beyond the town, the possibility of being free when freedom came. Benedita wanted to promise Maria everything, and knew she could promise only some of it. Instead, she tied a neat knot in the hem and hummed a lullaby she had been taught by a woman whose name she could not quite remember. There is a single rhetorical question that seems to demand the listener's voice. If there is no law to protect you, what avenues remain for justice? That question does not seek an answer here. It hangs, waiting, because it is the space where sympathy and judgment wrestle. As the months gathered into one another, Benedita's act of service became so seamless that the house could not imagine it as anything but a part of itself. The repetition had that effect. Make a transgression ordinary, and the world will call it habit. The world prefers tidy causes. It prefers neither to suspect nor to be seen as responsible. Benedita worked within that preference. On an afternoon that smelled faintly of citrus and old varnish, Benedita prepared the tray. There was nothing conspicuous on it. A silver teapot polished until it reflected a small, distorted world. 3 porcelain cups with thin rims, a pitcher of cream. The hand that carried the tray had no trembling to betray the storm under her ribs. She walked through the corridor, under a shaft of light that made dust motes visible like a slow, drifting constellation. As she entered the room where Donna Isabel sat, Benedita saw the woman's silhouette against the window, the stern line of nose, the hair arranged in a tight coil, the hands resting on the arm of the chair. Guests pretended at casual chatter. The clock on the mantel marked the hour in a small, authoritative sound. Benedita set the tray on the small table. Her fingers did exactly what they had always done. A tilt here, a lift there, a careful placement of the cup to the right of the seat, her motion indistinguishable from 1,000 other motions she had made in a life of service. For an instant she thought of the Cenzala, of the children asleep on rough blankets, of the women whispering in the dark, and then her attention returned to the porcelain in her hands. She filled the cup, as she had filled it 1,000 times, with the practiced motion of someone who had learned to make their life invisible. Then she placed the cup, and the story slowed to the precise moment of its fiercest tension. The interval between the cup arriving and it touching the woman's lips. In that interval, Benedita's entire life compressed. The harvests, the songs, the scalding of palms in kitchen pots, the rubbing of ointments on a child's back. She walked away from the table in a gait that held composure like armor. The rest of the house moved as though nothing had happened. The guest continued to speak about futures and debts and the price of coffee in the markets. Donna Isabel lifted the cup and brought it toward her mouth with the same small, imperious tilt. The porcelain kissed her lips. The steam vanished. Benedita folded her hands and let the world claim its own explanations. This is where the first part of the story rests. Not on a triumph or a confession, but on the suspended breath before consequence. The arc of patient vengeance had begun, quietly, in the smallest of rituals. It had been born of grief and shaped by the household's complacency, given substance by the very words the doctor would soon speak to make illness respectable. What followed would be a retelling of slow change, of bodies, of social narratives, of the ways a house can change its own story in order to avoid shame. The rest of the tale moves through years, measured decline, medical pronouncements, the careful erasure that privilege performs. There will be a death certificate that names a convenient cause. There will be a funeral that rearranges memory. And there will be the long after, when freedom arrives and stories move from lips to archives, sometimes changed, sometimes lost, sometimes preserved in the small, stubborn ways that people remember. But for now, the cup has been set down, the woman has drunk, and Benedita has returned to the kitchen where light falls in rectangles on a table. Outside, the fields of Fazenda das Flores stretch toward the horizon, where coffee trees stand like small, ordered soldiers. The Casa Grande keeps its secrets well, and the Cenzala keeps some secrets better still. The slow clock of private vengeance has begun to count. The slow clock of private vengeance had begun to count. Days, then weeks, unspooled into a pattern that softened into the background of the house. Benedita moved among it like a shadow that had learned to mimic light. Donna Isabel's complaints matured into a vocabulary of delicacy, an ache in the ribs, a heaviness that made her rise from chairs with a small, brittle moan. She stopped attending the long dinners she once hosted. She declined invitations, citing fatigue and nerves. The family accepted each excuse the way a river accepts pebbles, letting them slide and keeping its surface unruffled. The physician's visits became regular. He was a man of clean assumptions, a medical education that favored classification over curiosity, a bedside manner that paid for itself in social calm. He listened to lungs, pressed here and there, wrote words in a neat hand on the pages of his ledger. In polite households, his certainty was currency. Phrases like chronic condition or nervous depletion passed easily through drawing rooms and into the ledger of respectable causes. What the physician could not see, what no ledger could name, was how a life narrowed to small humiliations would change the shape of a body. Benedita watched that change like a cartographer who traces a coastline, noting every subtle indentation. Donna Isabel's cheeks hollowed, not in the fashion of starvation, but in the peculiar way of someone whose inner weather had turned gray. Her fingers trembled when she reached for embroidery. Her color became a private thing. She avoided mirrors. Guests murmured about the weather and the strain of management, and the words circulated like safe currency. Neighbors began to notice too, but their noticing settled into rumor rather than inquiry. A woman from a nearby fazenda mentioned at market that she had heard Donna Isabel had a strange malaise. Another whispered about the doctor's inability to do more. Detail thinned at the edges as small towns tend to do. Gossip prefers a shape it can hold. Some feared that the sickness was a contagious scandal that might leach into their own reputations. Others, protecting their social standings, chalked it up to fate. Within the Casa Grande, the staff rearranged its rituals to accommodate the change. The coffee hour shortened. The sharp-scented citrus soap made less frequent appearances. Benedita's tray was accepted with a new pallor of caution. Those who saw her every day, the kitchen boys, the washerwomen, read her face as if it were a book already written. A posture of serene care that hinted at a private interior hardening like resin. They did not pry. In the Shenzala, there is an economy of silence born of necessity. Many things are known and named only in the slow passing of glances. There were near misses. Once, a housemaid lingered too long, her fingers brushing a spoon that had been rifled through the night before. She paused, eyes narrowing as she tried to recall the exact position of the teaspoon. Quick as a cut, Benedita stepped forward with a smile and a story about a ledger to be balanced, and the moment snapped into place. Another time, a guest's sleeve knocked the teapot, and a few drops tumbled onto the rug. Conversation stuttered. An observer might have read the pause as tension. In truth, it was a microscope. Benedita's calmness was the field that saved the mission. Those small disturbances made Benedita's caution deepen. She avoided ceremony in which others might notice a change in pattern. She stopped staying in the parlor after service. When children from the Kenzala played in the shadows of the veranda, she would pass them with a quiet hum and a face that refused any hint of triumph. She carried out the work with the same humility that had been demanded of her for years, and in that humility there was a coiling of self into a narrower, stranger shape. 3 years is a long time to keep a particular rhythm while the whole world spins. In the house, time lost its calendar and took on the weight of repetition. Benedita measured seasons in the way the house's tea ritual altered, the tilt of the cup in summer, the steadying of hands in winter. She watched the great cycles of harvest and sale, the arrival of buyers from the city, the ledger books thickening with profits that never trickled down. She watched how wealth made people care more about appearances than about truth. In those years, her plan was not a one-time act of rage, but a sustained labor, an invisible maintenance that required as much persistence as any day's cooking. Donna Isabel's decline had its pattern. There were days when she laughed and circled the parlor like a queen who had forgotten she was sick. There were other days when she withdrew to her rooms and slept for hours, her breath shallow. The physician continued to provide names for these states in calm syllables. Degenerative complaint, he suggested at one point. A constitutional weakness, he declared at another. The words became a script that allowed family members to perform their worry without probing. The coronel attended to business with an austere focus, signing ledgers and speaking to brokers about price per sack. He expressed concern in the language of proprietorship. We must watch her closely, he told visitors, as if her state were a line item in an account book. Outside the house, the rumor of something uncanny spread slowly, like a scent. People altered their habits around the tea tray. One matriarch from a neighboring household declared she would no longer accept a beverage if she could not choose the leaves herself. Small acts of caution multiplied into social patterns. A subtle suspicion that the kitchen held secrets. But suspicion did not equal proof, and in a system where the bodies of the enslaved were not testimony, the claims of those who lived in the Cenzala were faint as breath against wind. The moral complexity of what had begun, the arithmetic of harm and reparation, continued to lodge in Benedita's bones. There were nights when the house was quiet, and the stars edged the horizon like a row of small knives that the weight of what she had set in motion pressed down. She would wake with the image of Maria's back, and the smell of citrus and frying oil would be a fleeting ghost. Sometimes when the moon was thin and the kitchen fire burned low, Benedita would press her forehead to the wood of the table and feel in the grain a history that was longer than her life. She knew that her act had altered not just one life, but the moral grammar of her being. It had been an answer, as she understood it then, to a particular kind of lawlessness. It had also been a theft, a taking of another's future. She held both facts with the same steady hand. Maria, for her part, lived in the world that had been reshaped by the violence and its secret reply. She grew into a woman marked by what had been taken from her and by what she had survived. Her scars were not merely physical. They were gestures in posture, pauses in laughter, a carefulness about men and about power. She worked. She married in time, a man who had been a field hand and who carried his own scars. They built a small life away from the Casa Grande after the abolition currents began to change things on an institutional scale. But the memory of the plantation stayed like an uprooted tree within them, roots exposed, still reaching. As the years moved forward, so too did the larger world. Slavery in Brazil ended only in 1888 with the Lei Áurea, but the slow reconfigurations began earlier. Economic pressures, rumors of reform, and the changing costs of labor nudged some plantations into gradual modification. At Fazenda das Flores, the coronel grumbled of decline and of changing markets. He complained to men in the city about tariffs and climate. At home, he adjusted household practices to preserve reputation. He kept the funeral of his sister composed in marble, as if a grand ceremony could fix history's more discordant notes into an acceptable tableau. The day Donna Isabel finally died was not dramatic in the way of a novel's turning point. It came like a clock's last chime, another small contraction of breath, a hand going still, a physician's measured assessment. The death certificate, when it was written, used the language the house wanted, complications of a chronic condition, and a reference to organic failure. The coroner arranged an ornate funeral, complete with a hearse and hired mourners, ribbons and a sermon that emphasized piety and the vanity of life. The neighbors brought wreaths and wrote in a ledger a message of condolence acceptable for a family of their standing. At the funeral, the Casa Grande displayed its grief in a choreography of propriety. Guest lists were polite and long. Men spoke of Donna Isabel's management and her decorum. Her portrait, painted in the stiff style of the time, hung with a shawl over its frame, as if even that image needed to be softened. The ritual of mourning flattened the complexities into a narrative that satisfied the social imagination. A respectable lady taken by frailty, loved by kin, remembered for her stern kindness. No doctor was asked to reconsider language. No servant was raised in the pulpit to speak. The ritual did its work of sealing the official story. Benedita attended the funeral in the manner children of a house learn to attend, hands folded, face neutral. She stood at a distance where grief could be private and comportment public. In the crowd, she was a silhouette of duty, the servant performing the last obligations. She watched the coronel place a wreath and heard the minister's voice lift in words that had nothing to do with what she had done. After the ceremony, there were toasts and speeches beneath the wide eaves, and discussions returned to trade and to the seasons. The plantation took a breath and resumed itself. Rumors swirled. Some neighbors, privately, felt relief. An unspoken fear that the strange illness might have been contagious lifted with the coffin. Others whispered about the quietness of the kitchen, about where Benedita had been seen at certain times. But suspicion died quickly in the absence of evidence. The social order, which preferred simple narratives, closed ranks like a flower folded at dusk. For Benedita, the outcome was a strange mixture of release and further confinement. The immediate danger had passed. The woman who had inflicted bodily punishment on her child was gone, but the act that had altered that trajectory had reshaped Benedita too. She carried within her a darkness that had weight and texture. She moved differently in the world. She could not undo the hours of her life. At night she would sometimes taste, in memory, the steam of porcelain and the small metallic tang of fear. She tended Maria and the children as she had always tended them, but a part of her had been made into an instrument of another's end. That part refused to be reassured simply by the absences funeral rites had smoothed over. Decades passed. The country changed. The coronel died in time of a fever while traveling. The plantation passed through hands and its ledgers grew thinner. When abolition legally arrived, Benedita was older and walked with a slight limp from years of labor. Still, she carried a name and a life outside property law. She moved in with Maria and the small household Maria had built with her husband. The Cenzala emptied gradually as men and women left for towns, for making trades, for the ambiguous freedoms that awaited them in urban centers. The land itself was reorganized. Some fields converted, some sold off, some turned into smaller plots. The Casa Grande, though, lingered, a high, whitened presence overseeing the past, like a memory that will not fade. Benedita's confession, when it came, was not a dramatic courtroom scene. It arrived, as many of these confessions do, in the hush of late life. She sat by a dim window while Maria tended a pot and listened to the old woman's voice as it broke and reknit itself. Benedita told the story in a low cadence, as if speaking to a friend across a fire. She rehearsed none of the kitchen motions that had been her craft. She only told the truth she had held. She said the words that transformed memory into account, that she had done it, that she had watched Donna Isabel fade, that she had meant to balance the scales for the scar that marked her daughter. Her speech was not triumphant, it was exhausted. It carried both relief and a tidal pull of remorse. Maria's reaction was complex and not easily compressed into a single moral act. She listened, and in listening she carried an old grief into a new form. There was anger, a fierce, rightful flame that flared and then settled into a tempered sorrow. There was also recognition. In the Cenzala, one learns the kinds of choices that labor under violence make necessary. Maria had seen the world from the angle of a carved wound. She had lived with the memory of the whip on her back, and with the knowledge that the law had not protected her. In the private room where the confession happened, she did something that some might call forgiveness, and others might call acceptance. She placed her hand on her mother's, and let the two hands remain for a long time. Word of the confession did not travel widely. That is always the case with such tales. They make their way into the slow channels of memory rather than the highways of print. The story became part of the oral web, told at housewarmings, at wakes, at neighborhood gatherings, each time losing some details and gaining others that suited the needs of the moment. For some, it was a necessary writing, an act of clandestine justice responding to law's silence. For others it remained an ethical knot, a woman taking another woman's life in the face of systemic cruelty. Both truths coexisted. In the spaces between them, community made meaning. Time continued its attrition. The Casa Grande, in the 20th century, found new life as a symbol of a past many wished to recall with a sense of tasteful nostalgia. It was preserved, eventually, as a heritage site. White columns, manicured lawns, rooms staged to look as they might have in a late 19th century portrait. Visitors walked through with guidebooks that favored upholstery and the refinement of dining sets. The story displayed on a modest plaque talked of the plantation's role in regional agriculture, the architectural style, the economy of coffee. The plaque did not carry, in blunt language, the accounts of the Cenzala's burns, the dozen small humiliations, or the whispers of vengeance that had once threaded the house like a thin rope. There is an irony in how heritage often operates. The Casa Grande was preserved as if memory were an aesthetic exercise rather than a living archive. Photographs were framed of family portraits. The kitchen was arranged to demonstrate techniques of domestic management and for the benefit of good photography. Visitors admired the silver, the porcelain, the sweeping staircases. Some local guides mentioned the names of the elite, the coronel, his sister, but rarely, if ever, did the official narration include the detailed histories of those who served. The Kanzala, when referenced at all, was a footnote. The community remembered differently. In the yards of small houses and in the stories told in kitchens where the flames still leapt, Benedita's story remained. People repeated it, not to celebrate violence, but to complicate it. They used it to ask questions about the kinds of justice that are possible when laws fail, about the forms of agency that are hidden in plain sight. They argued in whispers about whether clandestine acts were liberation or another chain. These conversations kept the memory alive, where official narratives tried to smooth it. There is a lesson in the way the tale passed into memory. Public history tends to prefer heroes and villains, tidy arcs and moral clarity. But lives do not fall into the categories history asks of them. Benedita's life was threaded with contradiction, militant love and secret taking, domestic care and the orchestration of death, a claim on justice that collided with an ethics of violence. To insist upon a single label, hero, villain, avenger, criminal, would be to flatten the complexity. The story resists such flattening because it lives in the knotted topography where oppression leaves few clean roads. Thinking about this story asks us to hold two things at once. First, the structural cruelty of the Casa Grande, an institution in which human beings were owned and riveted into labor, created landscapes of harm that made certain acts seem the only refuge for a kind of justice. Second, even under those conditions, to take a life is to alter the ethics of the taker. The soul does not remain unchanged. Benedita survived, but she carried the weight of what she had done. Maria survived, too, and carried a shape of sorrow that included both her mother's choices and her own scars. Both women lived with the consequences, and both decisions and consequences were real. There are other small afterlives to the story. The doctor, when his ledger was examined by a later generation of local historians, left notes that read like common misapprehensions of his era. He had not considered certain possibilities because the social frameworks of his time would not allow him to. The coronel, who had died with his own ledger balanced in a way that obscured the humanity beneath, left his land to distant heirs who did not always understand the histories they inherited. The plantation itself, as property, moved into the hands of managers who cared as much for profit as those before them. Structures remained, memory shifted. In contemporary times, when scholars and activists look back, the story of Benedita is sometimes invoked in discussions about resistance. It is used to ask hard questions about the mechanisms of redress when formal justice is absent. Did she break moral law? Yes. Did she do what she believed was necessary to answer an injustice the system would not hear? Also, yes. These dualities make the tale useful as a prompt for debate, for reflection, for coursework. But they also make it dangerous to reduce to an anecdote in a lecture. There are, inevitably, modern conversations that would like to simplify, to cast Benedita as a folk heroine whose methods we must emulate, or as a monster whose method invalidates any sympathy for her cause. Both simplifications misread what the historical record, and the oral memory that persists, offers. The story asks us to feel discomfort, and to hold it without turning it into spectacle. It asks us to ask hard questions about the kinds of resistance that appear when every lawful route is blocked by the machinery of power. If you visit Fazenda das Flores today, you might see a house that has been staged for photography, a green lawn, a placard with dates. If you listen to neighborhood memory, you might be led to a small, overgrown garden where an older woman once kept her mortar and where children played among the roots of an old fig tree. If you ask the right elders, you may hear, in a voice folded with age, the lines of the story as it moved from mouth to mouth, the whipping, the slow ritual, the doctor's hands, the coffin, the quiet confession. They will tell you that history is never only what the plaques say. It is also what people keep in their chests and pass from hand to hand. When we think about this story in the present, we must also think about the ethics of telling it. The tale is violent. It contains suffering that is hard to witness. The choices of those who lived under oppression are not merely historical curiosities, but lived realities with present echoes. For those reasons, the narrative must be told with care, honoring the dignity of those who suffered, refusing to fetishize pain, and resisting the temptation to instruct or to glamorize acts of harm. That caution extends to how stories like Benedita's are preserved in institutions. Museums can choose to neutralize hard truths in the name of aesthetics. They can choose, alternatively, to embed difficult histories in fuller contexts, plaques that include testimony, archival materials that show the lives of those who worked and suffered, programming that invites critical reflection. If a Casa Grande becomes a museum, let it remember all the house's people, not just its portraits. Let it name the labor and the pain that undergirded the silver and the lace. There are moments that remain with those who have heard the tale from elders, the image of Benedita's hands steady on a tray, Maria's back as a map of punishment, the minister's voice at a funeral, smoothing language into comfort. These are the images that linger, because they tell us about the ordinary mechanisms that keep systems of power running. Rituals, polite phrases, the way a physician's notes can be a shield for the privileged. They tell us also about the ways resistance can be hidden in the seams of ordinary acts. In the end, 1,000 Days of Poison, The Silent Revenge in Minas Gerais, is both the story of an individual and a mirror of a system. It is the portrait of a woman whose choices were made within conditions of extreme constraint, and who used the only tools available to her to answer a pain the law would not acknowledge. It is also a cautionary tale about the scars that clandestine justice leaves on communities and on conscience. What then should we take away? Perhaps no single answer suffices. We can hold the history as a provocation, to ask how societies structure justice, to ask what counts as resistance, to ask whose memories are preserved and whose are erased. We can demand that heritage sites tell fuller truths, and that public histories count the costs of power as part of the record. We can ask ourselves personally what we would do in the face of institutional denial, while remembering that imagination is not experience and that moral judgment in the abstract is easy compared to decisions made under duress. If you carry one image from this story, let it be twofold. The small porcelain cup, pale steam rising like a private signal in a crowded room, and the quiet face of the woman who served it, whose choices were both a wound and an answer. Let those images sit uncomfortably together. This story is based on regional oral histories and accounts reported in local memory. Some details remain indefinido, where archives are silent. For those who wish to learn more, please check the video description and pinned comment for suggested readings and source notes that our researchers compiled. If this story moved you, or unsettled you, leave a single word in the comments that captures your reaction. One small gesture that keeps the conversation alive. And if you want more forgotten histories told with care and context, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. There are more layers to uncover, more voices to listen to, more questions to ask. We close not with a verdict, but with an invitation to remember critically, to see the Casa Grande as both a beautiful facade and a site of hard histories, to honor the people whose labor was the backbone of such houses, to keep listening to the voices that remain, so that memory is not silenced by marble and plaque.